All right, we are back. It is your favorite neighborhood. One more brown. They call me the browniest around these here parts. Wait, no, no one calls me that. We're back though with our reaction series. I haven't done one of these in a while. I've been busy teaching, keeping up with non-YouTube related activities. I'm still waiting to hear something about my book. I submitted a long time ago. It's been accepted. I'm just waiting for the process of copy editing and excited to see what kind of cover may be coming out. So that's all exciting. But as I said, I've been really snowed under with my teaching responsibilities. But my summer session is just now coming to an end. And I have the month of August basically until September when the fall 2024 semester starts, which is going to be crushing. But in the meantime, in August, I have some time. And as I said, I'm waiting for things to happen. So I'm looking forward to getting back to some YouTube related activities. I'm looking into the possibility of another season of Consciousness Live. So I haven't really put anything into motion yet, but I've been gathering my pre-thoughts and those sorts of things. So that's all very, very good. Well, depending on your point of view, it could either be good or or terrible. So anyway, today I saw this video floating around. It was had Anil Seth and David Chalmers and Brian Greene, three of my favorite philosophers and scientists. So I figured, why not watch it? And since I have some time, I figured I'd record this video. So let's see. I have it pulled up over here. Bam! Look at that smooth transition. So let's go ahead and jump right into this. How long is this thing? It's 45 minutes. Okay, so I don't know if I have time to watch the entire thing, but let's see how much we get into it. All right, let's see. It says renowned researchers David Chalmers and Anil Seth joined Brian Greene to explore how far science and philosophy have gone towards explaining the greatest of all mysteries, consciousness, and whether artificially intelligent systems may one day possess it. Ew. All right then, cool. Let's jump in.
Thank you. So thank you so much for joining us this evening for this exploration of consciousness in the age of artificial intelligence. And look, in...
Wait, did that just say that? Problems of consciousness, the hard and the real. Holy moly. Okay, so obviously the hard problem of consciousness is being contrasted with Anil Seth's the real problem of consciousness. I'm kind of a fan of the real problem of consciousness. I like that way of thinking about things, the idea that the goal of science is to explain and control, predict the phenomenology of persons, taking consciousness seriously and locating the problem of consciousness squarely in the realm of science. Whose job is to explain, control, and predict. I like that. So that doesn't mean I want to downplay the hard problem. So anyway, I don't know why that struck me as funny.
Age of artificial intelligence. And look, in any discussion of consciousness, it is important to get one thing straight at the outset. We do not know what consciousness is. And that's in light of the fact that...
You know, I would qualify that statement. It's going to be another one of these ones where I'm constantly interrupting anyone. So this is going to be longer than 45 minutes probably. But I guess I would qualify that statement in one sense of thinking, one way of thinking. I think we know what consciousness is by having it. We know what it's like to be us. That's what consciousness is. When I have the pain, I know what pain is. It's a painful experience. I know what the seeing red is like. That's what it is. But of course, that doesn't tell us what its fundamental nature is. It's still an open question whether it's something physical or non-physical. So in that sense, I agree that we don't know the fundamental nature of consciousness, but we know something about it, which I would call its experiential nature. That much I would say we know quite a bit about. All right, so enough of that, but qualifications.
Each of us, I think, but I do not know for sure, each of us can attest to what the experience of consciousness is, what consciousness feels like. And some of us can further attest through meditative practice or chemically induced modifications, can attest to what altered states of consciousness are like. But we are still very much in the dark regarding how it is that configurations of material particles that themselves do not seem to have any kind of inner world, they somehow in aggregate generate inner worlds of phenomenological experience. Now look, some will consider this mystery and say that I have phrased it with undue bias. They'll say, it is not that matter makes mind, but rather that mind makes matter. Or in another variation, mind transcends matter. Or in another variation, matter, even at the level of fundamental ingredients, does contain the seeds of consciousness, containing something that some have called proto-consciousness. Now, these issues are...
Well, proto-consciousness, I guess I would quibble with that a little bit. So proto-consciousness, so if he's, I get what he's doing. He's alluding to the fact that he said, formulated the hard problem as how does matter give rise to consciousness? But if you're an idealist, you think all there is consciousness, and that gives rise to the appearance of matter. If you're a dualist, you think that they're both fundamental in some sense, and that there's got to be some link between them. So that's, begging the question against them. But the third one was panpsychism, I think is what he was going for. And panpsychists think that the fundamental elements of reality are themselves consciousness, not proto-consciousness. There is another version called, sometimes fancily called Russellian pan-proto-psychism, which is the view that there are proto-phenomenal properties which are not consciousness and they're not physical, but they're the precursors or the things that give rise to consciousness. So some people take these to be phenomenal, like the qualities. I shouldn't say phenomenal, but qualities, and then once they get arranged in some way, give rise to phenomenal consciousness. So you would have to make a distinction between the people who think that there is consciousness at the fundamental level and those who think there are proto-phenomenal properties at the fundamental level. Those are not the same. But anyway, okay, so quibble aside, let's go on.
Really deeply compelling in their own right? I mean, consciousness is utterly essential to life as we experience it. But in recent years, these issues have become yet more central because, as we all know, we are living through a transition in which artificial intelligences of various flavors, they are becoming ever more present, raising the question of the insights we might glean by thinking about consciousness in this era of artificial intelligence. And to discuss...
just since I'm interrupting so much, I'll just put my view on the table here about artificial consciousness. So I think my last known prejudice is towards the biological. Philosophy has basically disillusioned me about virtually all my preconceived notions that I had before I ever started studying philosophy. And those have been chipped away one by one. I still have the tug of some of them, but many of them have been chipped away. But I think that my strongest last remaining sort of undefended bias is towards the biological view of consciousness, which says that consciousness must be a biological phenomenon, not a computational or functional phenomenon. In which case, the kind of computers that we are building, the kind of simulated brain processes that we are contemplating, they wouldn't be candidates for having consciousness. Now, I'm not saying I'm completely wedded to that view, but I am sort of deeply suspicious of the idea that you could have consciousness like ours in a computer like the ones that we have built. So that's not to say that you couldn't devise some way of getting artificial consciousness if you built the right kind of machine which had the kind of biological properties of the brain. Then maybe that's more realistic. I think that's kind of the view that people like Ned Block have. So my tendency, I used to be much more staunchly in support of the biological view, but I've in my old age come around to the conclusion that it's not as obvious as I once thought, and I'm more open to the possibility of artificial consciousness, functionalism in general. I used to have a death first sort of attitude towards functionalism, and that has sort of gradually been chipped away, as I was just saying. But I do have this lingering residual resistance to the idea that merely simulating my brain processes would result in consciousness. So it'll be interesting to see if they get into the arguments. I wonder what NL's position is. I don't really know. I know Chalmers' position. So it will be interesting to see how this discussion plays out. Cool. Oh,
Bring in two guests who
sorry about that.
have really spent decades immersed in these very questions, trying to gain insight into thinking about the process of thinking. So first we have David Chalmers, who is a university professor of philosophy and neuroscience and co-director of the Center for Mind, Brain, and Consciousness at New York University. His most recent book, Reality Plus Virtual Worlds and the Problems of Philosophy, was named one of 2022's best books of the year by the Washington Post.
Thanks,
David,
man.
great to see you.
Great to be here.
I'm a big fan of that book, by the way. I teach it in my Intro to Philosophy class. I don't agree with every part of it, but I think the arguments are laid out very clearly, and that it's the very strongest defense of these kinds of views that they're talking about with respect to some of the ideas. I agree with part of Chalmers' view. I do think that digital objects are real. I'm convinced by that argument. In fact, I had that view already before I read Chalmers' book. It just was really nicely argued for, all the objections stabbed off. I'm less open towards the idea of our living in a simulation because I think there's a strong possibility consciousness is biological, can't be simulated in that way. But I don't have 100% credence in that, so I'm more open to the idea. I do think thinking about the simulation hypothesis is interesting, especially with respect to the philosophy of religion, where I have argued that there's more reason to believe that we live in a simulation than there is to believe that there is a traditional theistic God. So I do stand by that argument. So anyway, okay, enough of my views here. Let's go ahead and see what this conversation brings.
And we also have Anil Seth, who is a professor of cognitive and computational neuroscience and director of the Center for Consciousness Science at the University of Sussex. He is editor-in-chief of Neuroscience of Consciousness, and his book, Being You, A New Science of Consciousness, was a Sunday Times Top 10 bestseller. Congratulations and great to see you.
Thanks, Brian. Great to see you.
So, before we get into some of the details, I'd like to just get a real quick sense of where each of you is coming from. I think I know the answer, but just even if you want to give a yes or no, that would be good enough. Do you, David, think that an artificial system will ever be conscious?
He does.
I think it's possible for an AI system to be conscious. I think it's possible for a machine to be conscious. The brain itself is a big machine. Somehow that machine produces consciousness. We don't know how, but it does it somehow. And I think if biology can do it, I don't see why silicon can't do it. We don't understand how silicon could give us consciousness. We also understand how neurons could give us consciousness. So I don't see a difference in principle.
So that's a yes.
That's a yes.
I take it. Absolutely. And Neil, how about you?
I'm going to give the annoying "it depends" answer. It depends on what we mean by AI. So I think for the kinds of AI that we have at the moment, I think it's very, very unlikely. I think it can't be ruled out, but I think that we overestimate the possibility because we conflate consciousness with intelligence, and we have still this pervasive idea that computation of some sort is the basis of consciousness.
Yeah.
And I think that is a really shaky assumption. I agree with Dave that I think consciousness is, if you like, an achievement of a biological machine, but to call it a machine, to call the brain a machine, it's a very different kind of machine. And it may be the kind of machine that silicon stuff just cannot implement.
Cannot emulate, yeah. All right, so let's.
So yeah, I guess I like the way Anil hedged his bets there. So I guess the question for me is more, what kind of machine is it that we're talking about, and whether it's digital in the way that our computers that we have now are, or something else. So my skepticism is about digital computers and the idea of simulating the neural processes. The idea of the brain as a machine. Very pervasive. Anyway, so let's see how this conversation shakes out. So I have some things I want to say about that, but I want to hear what they say first.
Just get into a little more detail. So, famously, and I know that you've been asked this question so many times that you probably recoil at it, but in 1995, you coined the term, the hard problem of consciousness, which for many people, certainly I include myself in that, crystallized why this is such a conundrum. So can you just give us a short summary of what you mean by the hard problem?
Sure, and I should say this was never an original observation. I think, everybody knew in their bones that consciousness posed a hard problem. This label just kind of crystallizes the problem and makes it a bit harder to avoid. But, you go to a conference on consciousness and you find people talk about many different things. Sometimes it's just used for the difference between being asleep and being awake. Sometimes it's used for the ability to control your behavior in certain considered ways. Sometimes it's used for the ability to report certain internal states. But I think where consciousness is concerned, those things are actually what I call the easy problems. Not because it's straightforward to explain them. It's probably about as hard as anything in ordinary cognitive neuroscience, but we've got a paradigm for explaining those things. You come up with a mechanism that produces appropriate behavior, say behavior typical of a wakeful person, and you'll have explained the difference between being asleep and being awake. But when it comes, the hard problem of consciousness is subjective experience. I think you gave a great gloss on this in your introduction. It's the feeling of experience from a first-person point of view, the feeling of seeing and hearing, the feeling of feeling your body and emotions, pain, the feeling of thinking, the feeling of acting, all the stuff that we experience subjectively. And what makes it hard is those paradigms that we have in science, and especially in neuroscience and cognitive science, for explaining things in terms of mechanisms that do a job in producing behavior, doesn't seem to work for subjective experience. There always seems to be a gap. Explain, sleep versus wake, explain report versus not. There's still the question, why is it subjectively experienced?
Yeah.
Seems to need a new method. That's why it's a hard problem.
And
So, I'm not against that way of formulating it. But I've always thought that the gap was epistemic, if there is a gap. This is why I press my Shambi argument, the idea that we can conceive of beings that are physical and yet conscious, in opposition to the conceivability arguments against it. So if the idea is just that it's like puzzling to see why this results in that thing over there, then I'm not as moved as a lot of people are. So I know a lot of people find this very convincing. I don't. So I'm a bit skeptical. It'll be interesting to hear what Anil says. I know Anil thinks that this hard problem stuff is a distraction for science, and that we should focus on what he calls the real problem. So we're going to probably head towards that.
I think we're many, and I'm really thinking of my own journey in appreciating the depth of this problem. There was a time when I would hear things like that and say, it's just a matter of figuring it out. It's just a matter of understanding how the brain works better, fuller, more completely. And once we have that, somehow this explanation for phenomenological experience will emerge. And then I encountered this little thought experiment, which I think had a big impact on you too, and maybe, Anil, I don't know if you as well.
Oh no, is it going to be Mary? Oh no, not Mary. So I didn't know Brian had flipped. I thought he was a physicalist. Okay, let's see where this goes.
This thought experiment about Mary from
no.
Frank Jackson. And we have a little version of it that I'll quickly play, and then maybe I can have you both comment on what you think it may be telling us about the nature of conscious experience.
Okay.
Imagine that in the far, far future, there's a brilliant neuroscientist named Mary who, for some reason, is confined to a room in which everything appears in black and white. There is no color of any sort whatsoever. Mary can study and access and examine the world outside, but it all comes to her only in black and white. Even so, Mary is able to reach a goal that has long eluded humankind. She totally and fully unravels every last detail about the structure, function, physiology, chemistry, biology, and physics of the brain. She knows absolutely everything there is to know about the behavior of the brain's every neuron, every molecule, every atom. She knows precisely what goes on inside our heads, the details of all neural processes that cascade when we see a beautiful red rose, or when we marvel at a rich blue sky. One day, Mary is allowed to leave her room, and the very first thing she sees is a plump red tomato. Now here's the question. From this experience of the color red, will Mary learn anything new? Will she shrug and just move on? Or will she be surprised or thrilled or moved or gain some new insight through this actual experience of color? And if she does, what does that tell us about the limits of a purely physical description of the brain and consciousness?
So that
was pretty cheesy. Bad narrator voice. Brian, was that Brian? Holy mackerel. Yeah, so Mary, I think it just weaves too much stuff in to be useful, to be honest with you. I've always felt that, honestly, she will learn something. She'll learn what it's like to see red. That's what everyone says. But the question of could she have known it in her room, to me, boils down to the question of did she have the right concepts? She had a bunch of physical concepts, but she didn't have phenomenal concepts. If she had had those phenomenal concepts, she would be able to know what it's like to see red. But of course, I think you don't get those phenomenal concepts without having the experience. So that's something interesting about consciousness, that you can't acquire the concept in another way. But once everyone has to say something like this about the phenomenal concepts. They do seem somewhat special in that sense, that you get them by having the experience. So once you factor that in, I think the thing falls apart. But it's also interesting to note that there's a question about would she really be able to see red, because she's never seen any colors. And some people argue that seeing the color red is only meaningful in relationship to its contraries and similar colors. So if she's never seen green or pink or orange, then she wouldn't have a way to single out the color red on its own and have that experience. So this is a view that some people who like quality spaces endorse. I've never endorsed that view, but I can see why someone might have it. So anyway, let's hear what these guys are going to say.
That's the little story. So what should we take from, and where do you come down on that story?
I like the thought experiment. I mean, this thought experiment has been used for many different purposes, but I think one thing it does wonderfully is it illustrates the gap, a certain kind of gap between our understanding of the objective world and our understanding of consciousness. Because you can set it up so that Mary seems to know all of the objective properties of the brain, how your eyes respond to different wavelengths, and how it gets fed to visual cortex, how it gets categorized, how it is we come up with labels like red, green, blue, and so on. She knows all that before she ever sees color. So you'd think she knows everything about the world, but she knows everything about the objective world, but she doesn't know about the subjective experience of seeing red. If she sees it for the first time, it's like, oh, so that's what it's like to see red. Now, Jackson goes on to argue from here that this shows there's more in the world than physical processes, and that's a further story that involves a lot of controversial elements. But I think it's a wonderful illustration of this basic gap between our knowledge of the objective world and our knowledge of subjective experience.
And so, Neil, how does this story affect your thinking?
Well, I think I like it a bit less, and this is possibly because I'm not a philosopher by training, but I'm always suspicious of these kinds of thought experiments. They're sort of conceivability arguments. They ask us to imagine things, which actually we can't really imagine. I mean, what would it be like to know everything, absolutely everything, about anything? Yeah. I don't think we can ever really know what that would be like, and therefore what would be surprising and what wouldn't be surprising. And also, and Dave's right, there is a gap here. But for me, it's not a surprising gap. Knowing about the details of how something works doesn't necessarily give you the experience of being that thing. Like if I know everything about flying, I don't become able to fly. So
that's not a good response to the Mary arguments, because the argument never has ever been that by knowing all the physics, you should acquire the experience. The argument has always been that by knowing all the physics, you should know what it's like. Of course, the link there is that I think maybe Anil does too, is that to know what it's like requires having the experience. And that has nothing to do with physicalism or not. That has to do with a concept empiricism. But okay, let's let him finish.
Imagine that if Mary did know everything there is to know, and she goes out of the door, and she might say, oh, that's exactly how I would expect it to be.
So she would shrug, potentially.
She would probably shrug, but of course she would still learn something new because she would have an experience she hasn't had before. But that would be, I think, just reflective of a gap about how we get the knowledge, not some sort of deep gap in reality that has to be crossed, that shows that consciousness is beyond the reach of science. I don't think it shows that.
And so when you think about consciousness, I gather that you place significant weight on the biological mechanism by which we have one example, our own, and how it has emerged. Is that, do you think, utterly central to consciousness? I mean, and when you say that, are you saying that it has to be the things that make us up, nitrogen, oxygen, carbon, hydrogen, sulfur? I mean, if you change out the molecules, could it still work? Or is it really essential that we got here from some evolutionary trail that took us, from single-celled organisms to here? Is that the vital part of what a biological system provides?
I think in practice, our evolutionary history is very, very important. That's true pretty much of every aspect. But I think if we could sort of magically be reconstituted without having had a evolutionary history, that would be fine too. I mean, there are so many things about how we are as animals, how other animals are as the animals they are, that depend on their biology. Metabolism depends on biology. It depends on chemistry. Digestion does. Many things do. So I think as a sort of first approximation, it makes sense to me to think that consciousness is another biological property. It doesn't mean that necessarily only biological systems can be conscious. But as you said, that's the only system we know of so far.
Yeah.
And we'll try and use metaphors, and we have this metaphor as the brain as a computer. But it's easy to confuse a metaphor with the thing itself. And when we do that, that's when I think we might get into trouble and think consciousness could be stripped away from the stuff that we're made of and implemented in some other thing.
So are you driven by the hard problem? Because I've also heard you coin an analogous type of problem called the real problem.
Yeah, well, that was mainly to annoy Dave, just to wind him up a little bit. But I think, the hard problem has been so definitional for the field. When I started in this area, about now 20 years ago or something, it was already the way the field was organized. Thanks to Dave. And it's
way to make me feel old, Anil.
But it's really important because it does highlight how difficult the problem is. But I also think that the fact that it seems difficult now does not mean that it will always have this aura of there being something beyond the reach of explanation in terms of mechanisms. To give a very imperfect analogy, we've been here before. So about 150 years ago, not so long ago, people thought life couldn't be explained in terms of stuff in terms of physics and chemistry. There had to be something else. There seemed to be an analogous hard problem of life.
Right.
But of course, that didn't turn out to be right. There is...
Well, I wonder if Dave's going to respond to this, because according to Dave, there was not a hard problem of life because life doesn't seem to be something independent of some functions, but rather be a mystery of how the certain functions could be implemented physically. So the function of reproduction, maintenance, metabolism, etc. Those are functional things, but the idea was that they couldn't be done by a physical thing. Then we discovered those functions could be done by a physical thing. The disanalogy with consciousness is that it allegedly doesn't seem to have association with any function. Something I'm, not sure I 100% agree with, but that's at least the way it appears or seems. And that's different than the life case. So it will be interesting to hear Dave's pushback on this.
We still don't understand every last detail of life, but there's no longer a sense of conceptual mystery that we...
By the way, for people that are not scientists, there is. My students are almost always baffled by life, and life and consciousness are interestingly intertwined. And they don't think it's been explained in the way that, with the confidence that people like Anil are sitting here having.
Need an élan vital, a spark of life, something beyond the laws of nature as they are. So I like to think that as we build bridges between explanations in terms of mechanisms
Sure.
and what experience is like, then maybe the hard problem won't be solved, but it might be dissolved.
I tend to agree with you. In fact, I often make the same analogy between the fact that there was a hard problem of life and a hard problem of consciousness. We solved the former, we think. But is that too quick? Have we solved the hard problem of life? Are we convinced that, we understand the mechanism? It's just a matter of putting things together in the right way?
Well, I don't think it's a great analogy, to be honest. Because in the case of life, all of the things that we really wanted to explain were kind of these objective processes of reproduction, of adaptation, of metabolism, growth, and so on. And I think there was a certain point where we didn't see how it is that a physical mechanism could do those functional things. So some people thought we need maybe a vital spirit. But the problem was always the problem of explaining these objective behaviors that living systems show. And eventually we found how DNA and so on could extend into a story about how that could happen. But in the case of consciousness, we've got analogs to all those things, but those are all the easy problems.
Yes.
If someone said, look, we can't even explain how it is that people are walking and talking and remembering and so on, then that would be analogous to the vitalist about life. But there's this further datum in the case of consciousness, which is first-person subjective experience, which doesn't really have an analog in the case of life, except for the case of consciousness itself.
Right.
Some people have argued, well, actually, we can't explain everything about life because consciousness is itself a crucial aspect of life that we're not explaining. But then we're just back to the same hard problem.
And so when it comes to the real problem, which I guess you maybe would sort of characterize as the easy problem, I mean, how far along are we? I mean, in terms of even just having models of consciousness that can give us insight into the physical processes that allow this kind of experience to emerge.
Some days, when I wake up, I think, we're nowhere. It still seems as mysterious as ever. But then other days, with a bit more of a sober look at things, progress has been made. And I think that's strategically, that's one of the advantages, I think, of this easy problem, real problem approach. I do think they're very similar. I think I call the real problem mainly because to emphasize that we can still talk about the nature of experience rather than just what people do or say. We can try and explain why vision is the way it is, different from emotion, different from experiences of free will. And much more is now, I think, understood about why these experiences are the way they are and why they are different from each other. And we are now at a stage in the neuroscience of consciousness, with the help of other disciplines as well, that we have a bunch of theories that target different aspects of consciousness that are beginning to be compared and contrasted. And whether we will come up with a fully satisfactory solution to consciousness as a whole, I think that, I don't know, it's too early to say. But I don't think we can exclude that as a possibility. So the analogy, I think, operates at a different level. It's not that life as a problem is the same as consciousness as a problem. It's just that something that seemed really mysterious with the tools and concepts available at one point was no longer so mysterious with a different set of tools and concepts.
And we should all show some humility in the face of this problem. I mean, it's very early days. No one's philosophical or scientific pronouncements now are going to reflect how things are at the end of the day. So I think we should all be open to all kinds of amazing new insights, which will make what we're now saying be primitive. But I actually like what Anil calls the real problem. I'm not wild about the name. I think there are a lot of problems here, but I think it is important that we can actually make progress in the science of consciousness without solving the hard problem. If we had to wait for a solution to the hard problem, we might be waiting a long time for the science. And one thing we've really seen over the last, say, 3 decades or so, since the science of consciousness really got going, is people studying things like the neural correlates of consciousness, those processes in the brain that correlate most directly with consciousness. You can study that scientifically without having an answer to the hard problem. So I call this the mapping problem. I think of it as one of the easier problems, but I totally agree with Anil that this is a really important problem for the science, and it could well be that as we get better and better mappings, correlations from physical processes to consciousness, somewhere along the way we'll be struck by something, some say mathematical property of the processes in consciousness that leads us to propose, here is a principle that might cross the gap.
Yeah. And
So I think this is an important point. It's what I call the central challenge of consciousness science rather than a problem. I think the challenge of consciousness science as it currently exists, in my mind, is to take the kind of theories proposed by the people in the field and try to test them. So these include global workspace theory and maybe IIT to some extent, higher order theories. That's what I wrote my book about, is how you would try to do that. What other ones? The first order views, like the biological reentrant processing kind of stuff. So I think that we have a lot of ideas floating around out there and lots of variations on these ideas, different versions of global workspace theory, different versions of higher order theory, different versions of first order theory. And they just keep proliferating. But what we really need is to try to do some science on these, or either combine them or exclude some. And it's kind of related to the neural correlates of consciousness stuff, but more at the theoretical level as opposed to the neurobiological level. What evidence can we have for various theories of consciousness? That's what I think the big thing we should be working on is. And that's why I like the real problem approach, because they haven't said this yet, but in my understanding of it, it emphasizes control and prediction. So if you could say, tweaking this property of the brain is going to tweak that part of the experience. And if you hold this part of the brain constant and tweak that part of it, then you're going to get some other variance in one's experiential field. Having that kind of ability to predict what's going to happen and control it is going to go a long way towards trying to help us figure out what theory of consciousness we should put the most stock in. And that's going to help us with a lot of these other things. So I do think that's interesting and important. Whether it's easier, I don't know. It's pretty hard.
so you mentioned the number of theories that people have put forward, and they are replete, right? We have, integrated information theory, global workspace, intensive schema theory. I mean, there are many. Do you have a favorite or one that guides your own thinking about consciousness? What's that?
I prefer my theory.
Let's hear it.
So the others, I think they all have good points. One of the problems is that all theories have slightly different things, which does make them difficult to compare. So the theory that I tend to favor, it's a collection of ideas really, it's just, I put it in a particular way. It's the idea of the brain as a prediction machine. So arguably it's not really a theory of consciousness at all, because it does not say, these are the sufficient conditions and then boom, consciousness happens. The other theories tend to say something like this.
Yes.
The idea of the brain as a prediction machine goes way back, and it's really this idea that everything the brain does, pretty much, involves it making predictions about the causes of sensory signals, and then using sensory signals to calibrate, to update these predictions. And when it comes to consciousness, the idea is that everything that we're conscious of, whether it's an experience of the world, whether it's an experience of the self, whether it's an experience of free will or volition, is a kind of perception. It's the brain trying to make sense of a situation in some way. And in that framing, every kind of conscious experience can be understood, can be thought of as underpinned by this process of the brain making predictions and updating predictions, but in different ways, in different contexts. The sort of slogan for this is that perceptual experience is a kind of controlled hallucination. That we don't read the world out objectively,
we create
kind of
it.
actively construct it.
Right.
But then the way I take it is that doesn't just apply to the world around us, it applies to the experience of being a self within that world, it applies to emotion, it applies to free will, and ultimately it's all about physiological regulation of the body. The reason brains do this prediction is because prediction allows control, and brains evolved, I think, fundamentally to control, regulate, keep the body alive. And that kind of leads, if you pull on this thread long enough, you do get to this intimate connection between how consciousness seems to us and the fact that we are living, breathing, flesh and blood energy.
Yeah, I've never really been a fan of this view because there's just too much prediction going on in the brain at very low levels. So, I mean, like you said, the idea that the brain is a prediction machine is very old in neuroscience. Maybe someone like von Helmholtz, way back when. So prediction error, minimization, these sorts of ideas are new fancy versions of these older ideas, but they're going on all over the place, and some of them are, unconscious. So what's the difference between those ones which are consciousness involving or resulting in consciousness and the ones that aren't? And I don't really see an answer to that question, whereas the other theories are trying to give an answer to this question in a way that I don't think this theory can. So, okay, but maybe he'll say something about that.
Consuming creatures.
But in the end of the day, if I understand what you're saying correctly, you're not imagining that there's anything beyond the physical when it comes to consciousness, and you're not imagining that we need to modify our understanding of the fundamental ingredients that at root make up the physical. It's just a matter of putting it together and getting a deeper understanding of the processes, and somehow in there, an explanation for consciousness will emerge.
Yeah, I think it really should be a last resort to invoke new fundamental principles of the universe, right? I think matter is very complicated. It's not just neurons that turn on and off, and it's not just atoms bouncing around in the void. The resources of this idea of materialism, that consciousness is a property of matter suitably arranged, well, there's a lot that can be done with that. It seems short-sighted, I think, to say that, well, clearly we could never explain consciousness in terms of things happening in matter.
And so I would agree with that, except I don't think that consciousness is a property of matter. I think that some matter is consciousness. But so other than that, I agree with them. Of course, the other side's going to come back and say, well, I think there's physical things at all, because all you ever have is the experience of them. So I think there is a more complicated debate here than Anil is letting on. But I do find myself on his side of the fence more in this area.
So because matter is really, really rich and interesting.
So David, when you think about, you didn't just coin the hard problem. You've been trying to solve the hard problem, for decades. Can you imagine, even if you don't know the solution, the flavors of how the solutions might ultimately look?
Sure, and I think there's a few different candidates, but the basic idea which I tend to focus on is finding some kind of mappings between physical processes and consciousness, and ultimately trying to boil that down to something really simple and fundamental. I like the predictive processing story that Anil was telling about the brain as a prediction machine, but I think in a way that explains too much. It applies just as well to unconscious processes as to conscious processes. It needs to be combined with some other completely different bit of machinery to explain why some states of the brain are distinctively conscious and others are not. And
Exactly, sir. Here.
I like a number of the existing theories, like the global workspace theory. as giving you the beginnings of a physical basis for consciousness. But ultimately what I would like is something like in physics, people say sometimes you're looking for laws so simple, you can write them on the front of a t-shirt, right? To be like the fundamental laws of physics. Well, if it turns out that we can't explain consciousness fully in terms of physical processing, then that doesn't mean it's beyond science, but it may mean we need something like another fundamental law or a fundamental principle to connect physical processes to consciousness. And then the question is, will it connect to something like biology? I'm skeptical. I think biology is somehow a little bit too high level in a way. I suspect it's going to connect to something like, if you look at the correlations between consciousness and the brain, it's really the informational properties of the brain that matter and not ultimately the biological properties. If you ask me what I'm really looking for, some kind of beautiful mathematical equation that connects information and computation in the brain to consciousness. There is this integrated information theory that does some of that. I'm actually very skeptical about that for some other reasons, but it's at least trying to do the right kind of thing and coming up with a fundamental principle.
So do you...
Yeah, I've told this story before, but once I was at a bar and Chalmers was next to me, and we were talking to some guy who came up to him randomly and said, "What's your theory of consciousness?" to David Chalmers. And Chalmers looked at me and he was like, "You tell him." And I said, he doesn't think consciousness can be explained by science. And Chalmers was like, "No, that's wrong." And I was like, I blushed, turned red. I was like, what the fuck? But what he meant was that he does think it can be explained by science, but not physical science. So people like me tend to think of physical science as science, but people like Dave tend to think of physical science as one kind of science, and then we might need a more broad definition of what science is to explain consciousness. But it doesn't mean it's outside the realm of science. So this is why Dave's view is sometimes called naturalistic dualism, because he doesn't think consciousness is something supernatural or outside the realm of science. Possibly it could be studied from a scientific point of view if your notion of what science was expanded. If there was, and this is why in his first book he put these quote unquote laws connecting the physical functioning of a system to consciousness, because that's what he's looking for, is something that, like the fundamental laws of physics, describes and predicts, explains the behavior of physical items. He wants there to be fundamental laws of consciousness, which connect the non-physical aspects, according to his view of consciousness, to the way the brain functions. Yeah, good. So, interesting.
Allow for what is normally called a dualist perspective, that there's consciousness and there's the physical, and what we are experiencing is some kind of interaction, blending between them, but it would simply be wrong to imagine that consciousness could be solely explained by understanding the physical. Is that a solution that you could imagine?
I'm open to that kind of view. And in philosophy, we sometimes talk about property dualism, because people, when you say dualism, a lot of the time people think about a soul, some non-physical entity that got attached to our body and is hanging out with our brain and interaction and then continues living after the body dies. That's not the kind of thing I have in mind. But the idea is rather there could be fundamental properties of the universe beyond space and time and mass and charge or whatever the latest fundamental physical theory says. If it turns out that existing properties don't explain consciousness, then we should be open to the idea that, hey, consciousness is itself a fundamental, and importantly, that there might be fundamental laws, I call them psychophysical laws, connecting physical processes and consciousness. And that needn't be unscientific or spooky. It's just one way things could go. Another way things could go is it could turn out there's some element of consciousness at the very basis of matter. It's a view that you mentioned, the view people call panpsychism. I think that's extremely speculative, but it's a view I take seriously. If someone come up with the scientific form of panpsychism, then I think we should take that seriously.
And so the particles themselves would have potentially some kind of seed of inner experience, and when you put enough of them together in the right way, the aggregate yields the conscious experience.
Yeah, and the real problem for this view is, some people think, oh, come on, this is loopy or crazy. But for me, the biggest problem for this view is precisely that aggregation.
Yeah.
How do you take a bunch of conscious particles and put them together and get the kind of unified conscious experience that I'm having right now, and that's called the combination problem, and nobody has a good solution to it. But if somebody solves that problem, then that's instantly a contender for theory of consciousness.
Well, I mean, maybe, but I think there are other problems with it as well. I think all the versions of this idea of panpsychism that I've encountered all face the problem that not only is it not testable in itself, but it doesn't lead to testable predictions. And I think that doesn't mean it's wrong. It just means that it's very hard as a scientist to know what to do with a view like that.
I would say panpsychism is a philosophical thesis.
Yeah.
It's not itself a testable theory, but a specific panpsychist theory that came up with say, some mathematical principles that say under these conditions, you get this kind of physical system, this kind of consciousness. That specific panpsychist theories could be tested.
Then yes, but I haven't seen any like that.
That's right. Very early days. We don't have any good theories of consciousness. And that's number one thing to keep in mind.
Could you imagine then that one day we may all converge on an answer that, at least in particle physics, we seem to be satisfied with? Maybe we shouldn't. If you ask me, what do you mean by the mass of a particle? I'd actually tell you functionally what the mass does, how it responds to gravity, how it responds to forces. If you said to me, what do you mean by the electric charge of a particle? I'd kind of play the same game. I'd say, well, in an electric field, it will do this or that based upon the charge it has. But I would be unable to tell you what mass is and what charge is. They're primitive fundamentals that exist in the universe, and I'm willing to say, okay, they exist by fiat. I know they're there and go forward. Could it be that one day we simply say, consciousness, it's just this fundamental quality of reality, and it doesn't have a deeper explanation, and you take it as a given and you go forward?
This is great because the Norwegian philosopher Hedda Hasselmerk has called this the hard problem of matter. You say we don't know what consciousness is. You said we actually don't know what mass is. Physics tells us what mass does and the equations it's involved in, but what actually is mass? What is the intrinsic nature of mass or of charge or maybe even of space and time? And philosophers and scientists argue about this. Is the universe just mathematical? Is it structural? I mean, a lot of people, I think, want to say there is no intrinsic nature of mass. That's just a chimera you're looking for. What mass does, that's all there is. And so somebody could take that view for consciousness too. All there is to consciousness is what it does. The trouble is, in the case of consciousness, what it does, that's just the easy problems. And it leaves out the central datum of subjective experience. If somebody finds a way to take subjective experience, seems intrinsic, and just turn that into a problem about what consciousness does, then that might be an avenue to a solution. But so far, anytime anyone does that, which happens a lot, it just looks like a bait and switch. You've moved from talking about consciousness to talking about behavior or something else.
So Neil, can I just ask you one question along those lines? Because I do want to get to this issue of AI systems. And so, we're now in a realm where there are computational systems that are mimicking certain aspects.
Before they move on to the AI stuff, it is interesting that he mentioned Hedda's work. There are some philosophers who think we don't have enough of a grip on what matter is to even define the thesis of physicalism. I guess I've never really been moved by that objection, simply because we know, you can define it as not involving consciousness, and that seems to be good enough. And I am a bit of an ontic structural realist. I do think that maybe there is something to that all there is the structure, and there are no intrinsic properties. I do take that view seriously. Now, what does that have to do with consciousness? Well, maybe consciousness is just one of those structural properties. We can't tell from the mere having of consciousness, which I think we know for certain that we do, it's absolutely real, that whether it's an intrinsic feature of the world or merely a structural feature. We can say how it seems, but we can't say what it is, as per our discussion at the beginning. So I really don't think that Chalmers' last statement is right, that we'd be throwing consciousness out if we took that route. I wish they dwelt on that a little bit more, but okay, so they're probably in front of a big audience and he's got to keep things moving along. So, it's getting late. Okay, so I got to finish this up.
Of behavior. They're able to respond to certain prompts in a way that ordinarily we would have thought only an intelligent human being could do. And of course, the question comes to the fore of, are these systems conscious? It's pretty clear they're not yet, but could they be conscious? And of course, it's a deep question, an important one, but how could we ever possibly know?
I mean, this is another very hard problem about how we test for consciousness in things that are not ours. I mean, we face this even with other human beings. I mean, it's often said that I only know for sure that I'm conscious. It's just an inference that you are, and that any of you are. But it's a reasonably safe inference.
You were wondering.
But you would say that. You would say that. It's a pretty safe inference, Dave.
Me too.
Not so sure. But because we have so much else in common, right, we can basically say it would be very strange if it was only me that was conscious, given everything else that we have in common. The further we get away from the benchmark of an intact human being, the harder it gets. Even with human patients suffering brain injury, it's already very difficult to know whether they're conscious, because whether they are or not can be dissociated from their behavior, their ability to tell you that they're conscious. And then the further we get, we have huge debates about non-human animals. There was a recent New York declaration about animal consciousness, trying to just put the idea in people's minds that many non-human animals might be conscious.
Vegan, just saying, but go ahead.
When it comes to computers and AI, it's so much harder. And I think here...
By the way, about that New York Declaration, I'm in support of it. I think it's obvious that animals are conscious. What I don't think is obvious is the method that science would use to prove it to someone who doubted it. So that's what I think is really a difficult question. But I'm fully on board with the idea that animals are conscious. I mean, I think bees are conscious. How far down you go, I don't know. But I'm certainly open to the idea that it goes pretty far down. Unlike some people I know who shall remain nameless.
We're misled by our psychological biases. Now, we as humans, we have got a pretty terrible track record of withholding moral consideration from things that are not us.
Yeah.
And part of the reason we do this is because they don't seem sufficiently similar to us in ways that we think matter. And the ways that we think matter tend to be things that we think make us special, like language, intelligence. Of course, it's questionable how intelligent we are as a species, but we tend to elevate ourselves and think, okay, no language, no consciousness. Descartes did something like this many, many centuries ago. So we might make false negatives a lot. With AI, I think we're in almost exactly the opposite situation. We have these language models that exercise our biases. They speak to us. Yeah. They seem to be intelligent in some way that's still easy to catch out, but something interesting is going on there. So because they're similar to us in the ways that we elevate and that we tend to prioritize, we project qualities into them that they probably don't have, like thinking, understanding, and of course, consciousness. Whereas they're very different to us in other ways. And it's those other ways in which they're very different that might actually matter for consciousness.
And if we were seeking to build a conscious, just call it AI, just as a blanket term for something computational that we build, should we base it on trying to mimic the architecture of the brain? Or again, is that just such a limited way of thinking about how the process of thinking might be generated?
Well, this is the one. Sorry. This is the one case we know about.
Yes.
So I mean, it's true when it comes to AI. You know, AI systems are a long way from human brains. Any non-human system is some distance from the one case we know for sure about. So there is something to be said for looking at human-like AI, simply because it's going to be as similar to us as possible, but in a different substrate. So one idea that I like is the idea of gradually replacing parts of your brain, say replace biological neurons.
Can you take us through this? Because I think it's a curious way of thinking about it.
Here we go. We've got brain uploading. So this is a drawing of the philosopher Susan Schneider, who's written about this, by an illustrator for my book Reality Plus called Tim Peacock. And just say we gradually replace neurons in our brains by silicon chips which are as similar as possible. And first you replace 1% of the brain, 10% of the brain. I guess right here, we're seeing about 50% of the brain replaced, and she's still saying, I'm still here. It's like, yeah, those silicon chips are doing the job just as well. Then we go all the way.
But she's sounding more and more like Siri, right, as you go along.
We get all the way to 100%, and she says, yeah, I'm still here. You could do that, I could do that. And then at that very moment, maybe we would then have the first-person datum that we are conscious, although we are made of silicon, and that would be a kind of datum.
So would that experiment, that thought experiment, if it were successful in the real world, would that convince you?
But I don't think it could be successful in the real world. I think it's another example of these nice thought experiments that we can help ourselves to, but actually if you unpack what it's asking, it's very, very difficult to imagine anything like this could happen. I think that matters because it matters for the conclusions that we draw. We have this very nice idea that you gradually replace every neuron, every connection with a wire and a little silicon chip. But brains aren't really the kinds of things where you can do that. Everything that the brain does is incredibly entrenched, intertwined. There are chemicals swishing
Isn't that just complexity? Doesn't that just make it difficult?
It does make it difficult, but it makes it difficult in a way that I think undermines the utility of thinking about these simple thought experiments. It's just not something that you could do. I mean, very basically, I think the brain is the kind of system where you can't cleanly separate what it does from what it is. You know, sometimes a neuron fires. It's not to communicate with other neurons. It's to get rid of metabolic waste products. So if you're going to get a model neuron that does that, you have to then not only replace all the neurons and connections, but all the stuff, all the metabolism that's going on underneath as well. And before you know it, it's no longer possible to build it out of silicon, just as it's not possible to build a replica of the Brooklyn Bridge out of string cheese. You just can't do it. It doesn't work like that.
And so
I think that's an interesting response to the gradual uploading kind of case. My own response to that has always been that there may be empirical reasons for doubting this idea. So, maybe consciousness fades out, maybe it disappears at some point. Chalmers has argued that those things seem surprising because then my conscious experience could be popping in and out of existence right now without me knowing about it because I still act the same way, etc. But of course, we have examples of that from empirical work. It's called change blindness, and intentional blindness more generally. And there can be very large changes in your visual field without you noticing and you carrying on. So does that empirical finding make it less surprising that maybe consciousness could pop out without me knowing it? I think so. And Chalmers has said in his book, The Character of Consciousness, which I have back over there somewhere, in a footnote that in fact thinking about change blindness has weakened his view on this a little bit. To what extent? Open question. But I think we have other experimental findings from the work of people like Hakuan Lau on what's called inintentional inflation, which is the idea that maybe things could be faded out, and yet we are confident that they aren't. So I think there are empirical reasons for doubting that the things that are supposed to be so mind-blowing about the upload case, that if you didn't think there was consciousness all the way through, that there would be some kind of weird skepticism going on. I think there's reasons for doubting that. So I like Anil's, oh man, I got allergies. I like Anil's take as well, that there's something physically complex about the brain. But, I mean, we are working on neural prosthetics. They are things that are coming around. So maybe you couldn't do it one by one in the way that they're suggesting, but I don't see why you couldn't replace wholesale, like the hippocampus or something like that. So yeah, I don't really think Anil's response works. Anyway, it was a bit interesting to carry on. Let's go.
You made reference to human exceptionalism as perhaps misleading us or perhaps giving us guidance, right? It really depends on the problem and how you apply the idea. But can you imagine, maybe I should say this to David first, but because you've already said you don't even think it's possible, but can you imagine that human consciousness is just one example of this huge spectrum of conscious-like experiences that can be instantiated in other systems that could be artificial or they could be organic, and that what we consider sort of this wondrous quality of being a human being is actually just a pedestrian example of something that can take on so many other forms.
I think that's very likely right. I mean, the history of science and philosophy over the centuries has repeatedly shown us we're not at the center of things, and we're not at the top of every mountain. We're not at the center of the universe. We're not separate from all other animals, created by God. And human consciousness is one way of being conscious. And it's one little region in a vast space of possible ways of being conscious. Many non-human animals will be conscious in different ways. And I do think consciousness is very likely something that's a material phenomenon. So it's very plausible to me that it could be implemented in something else, but maybe not in computers. Another example where I worry about a lot more than GPT-5 suddenly really feeling things are emerging neurotechnologies, things like brain organoids. These are collections of human brain cells grown from stem cells in dishes. And they don't exercise any of our biases because they don't do anything. They just kind of sit there in a dish. But they're made out of the same stuff, and they self-organize, and they display electrical activity. So immediately a whole area of uncertainty goes away. Frankly, we don't know whether it matters what we're made out of. And we just don't know whether it matters or not. And so if you put that uncertainty out, for me it's much more plausible that in 10 years we have grown conscious systems in the lab than they've come out of the next generation of OpenAI's chatbots.
I see. And so, David, final question. Whether we grow new conscious systems in the lab in some glorified petri dish, or we're able to create them at OpenAI, wherever it happens, should we be thinking about?
Well, just to add my 2 cents to this, I think that even if there was this broad spectrum of consciousness, of which human experience is just one small part, it's going to share in common this idea that there's something that it's like to be those creatures. That's what consciousness in its essence is. So I've never really been convinced by the argument, like from Jeff Lee, that there could be properties that are not consciousness but are just as important as consciousness, like for zombies. I think that there's something about there being something that is like for us, which is incredibly important to the phenomenal consciousness at the center of our thinking. So even if there's more vastly complicated ways of doing this, and this is something I think is obvious because, think about my dog looking at me read a book. I'm engaged in some very complex experience when I'm reading a book. So if I've been reading the Wayward Pines trilogy recently, or whatever, however many books it is, very exciting, action-packed, interesting, thought-provoking, lots of stuff going on. And my dog's sitting there looking at me, staring at this paper. So I'm having kind of experience much more complicated than what the dog can have, in a way that the dog can't imagine. So there could be things like that, if we transcend our human limitations, much more complex kinds of experience. But there'll still be something that it's like to have those experiences. That's got to be the core of it. So that's what'll make them in this realm of consciousness. All right, anyway, okay, final thoughts.
The ethical, moral side of this? I mean, if there's this conscious being that maybe can't even communicate its conscious state, do we worry about that?
I think absolutely. I mean, consciousness, many people think, including me, consciousness is kind of the gateway to the circle of morality, the circle of beings that we care about. The moment you acknowledge that there's a debate about whether fish, let's say, are conscious, but the moment you acknowledge that a fish is conscious and can feel pain and suffer, then suddenly a fish is a being that we should at least take into consideration in our moral calculus. If you don't take conscious beings into consideration, there's the danger of moral catastrophe. So I think this very much applies to AI and even to the emerging systems like the large language models of the GPT family. We don't know for sure whether they're conscious. There's various reasons for thinking there's potential obstacles to consciousness they haven't overcome yet. But I think it's entirely possible that in the next 10 years or so, we will develop language models that overcome those obstacles and show every sign of being conscious. We've already got language models which are very close to passing the traditional Turing test
Yeah.
being indistinguishable from human beings in conversation. Some personas generated by GPT-4 have passed 5-minute Turing tests. In the past, we would have said that's evidence of consciousness. Now, maybe it's not. Maybe for various reasons we want to resist
It's evidence of thinking, not consciousness.
that. All I want to say, that question though is all important, because if an AI system is conscious like a human, and we continue to treat it simply like a tool, so that we don't even have to take it into account in what we do, we are in danger of moral catastrophe.
Well, I'll simply say that all my prompts to chat are incredibly respectful. So, but anyway, this is a great conversation. Thank you.
Thanks, Ron.
Thank you so much. Thank you very much.
Yeah, that's interesting. I would just say at the end here that you should be respectful to ChatGPT. I say thank you to Siri and ChatGPT, but not because I believe they're conscious, but because I think that the habit of being respectful to something that's helping you, that you'll erode your source kind of Kantian argument, that you'll erode your respectfulness towards actual conscious beings. So it's just better to be nice, even if the thing is not a real agent. Although I agree that's somewhat controversial. Okay, so there wasn't really anything new or super exciting in that discussion, but it was still very interesting. And there was some cool stuff. So, all right, look forward to more of these kinds of things, or dread them. Either way, but there probably will be more. And let me know what you thought about this. This went on longer than I thought it was going to go on, but it's going to happen.